It is my very great pleasure to be able to introduce Rabbi Salem Pearce, who I have worked with through CJJ, and that has been a wonderful experience. But let me give you a little background about Salem aside from that. Rabbi Salem Pearce was ordained by Hebrew College Rabbinical School in 2018 and served as executive director of Carolina Jews for Justice for the past 2 years. And I have to say, she was our very first executive director. It was very exciting. Previously, she was director of organizing at Torah, the Rabbinical Call for Human Rights. She is a noted speaker and writer on immigration and the Jewish community, and her writing has appeared at JTA, Haaretz, Sojourners, and Shema. While in school, Rabbi Salem was a student fellow with Rabbis Without Borders, American Jewish World Service, and Torah. She also completed an internship at the Institute for Southern Jewish Life in Jackson, Mississippi. Before rabbinical school, she lived and worked in Washington, D.C. as a fundraiser for several nonprofit organizations and volunteered for and served on the board of DC Rape Crisis Center. Rabbi Salem was in Durham with her cat, Akiva. And so I give you Rabbi Salem.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's really lovely to be here with you all this morning. I was just telling Deborah before we got started that as I was creating a couple of slides that I'll share and thinking about what I wanted to talk about, I was just feeling really excited because this is the stuff that I love talking about. So I first want to just start with a few words about what's going on in our world. It is the work that I do is to engage in what's going on in the world. And I always see learning as part of what's going on, and it's not at all separate. So I'm sure many of us, most of us have our thoughts in Ukraine and with people that are fleeing war, fleeing violence and fighting for their country's sovereignty right now. And I know it hits the Jewish community for many of us in a specific way, because many of our ancestors came from the land that is now Ukraine. And our ancestors, many of them, most of them were either fled as refugees, as people are doing now, or were killed in genocide, either in pogroms or in the Holocaust. So, while war is always horrible, I just want to acknowledge a specific Jewish connection to it, including our own family experience, but then also some of the most famous and well-known Hasidic thinkers from Jewish history came from the place that is now Ukraine. And I want to just share a prayer from one of them, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who I had the privilege of studying when I was in rabbinical school. And so this is a prayer for peace. And it seems particularly relevant today because in this prayer, you'll hear some echoes of the prophets and other images from Torah that we will be exploring today. So Rabbi Nachman says, may it be your will, holy God, our ancestors' God, that you wipe out war and bloodshed from the world, and in its place draw down a great and glorious peace, so that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Rather, may all the inhabitants of the earth recognize and deeply know this great truth, that we have not come into this world for strife and division, nor for hatred and rage, nor provocation and bloodshed. We have come here only to encounter you, eternally blessed one. And so we ask your compassion upon us. Raise up by us what is written. I shall place peace upon the earth, and you shall lie down, and no one shall terrify you. And I shall rid the land of vicious beasts, and the sword shall not pass through your land. But let justice come in waves like water, and righteousness flow like a river. And God's presence fill the earth as the waters fill the sea. So may it be, and we say, Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you for receiving those words today. It's been a hard week. So I want to begin today. My talk is entitled, "What is Jewish about Social Action or Social Justice?" And I want to share, let's see, let me just make sure I'm sharing the right thing. There we go. Screen. And I will make this. Can everyone see this slide? What's Jewish about social justice? Okay, great. So I'm going to go through a little bit and talk about some aspects. And please feel free either to, I'm going to make sure I can see the chat, or raise your hand if you have questions as we go along. I'm happy to be interrupted, so to speak, and to have this be a conversation. I have, I could talk about this for a very long time, and I could talk for an hour or 10 hours. So it'll be fine. Whatever we get through, we get through. So I first want to start because, as I said, learning and action are connected. And I believe when we learn, whether we learn, Torah text, Talmud, or we just learn maybe something new, anything, that has real effect in the world. And so I'll just take a moment, and I'd invite you to think, who do you want to dedicate your learning to today? If you are a chat person, you can put it in the chat, or you can just hold it in your heart. Who do you want to direct the energy from your learning today? Who's in need of healing? Who's in need of support or gratitude? So please feel free, if you want, to put it in the chat. If you're not a chat person, if you want to just think about someone who might need some healing today, just take a moment. And I'll, as I alluded to before, I want to dedicate my learning today, my time with you today, to the people of Ukraine and its Jewish presidents who are doing holy work of resisting. And so we will say the blessing for the study of Torah together, opening our holy time together. So you can feel free to say it. It's on the screen with me in Hebrew, or just say Amen in affirmation. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, source of all, who wisely instructs us to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. And let us say Amen. Amen. Okay. So I'm going to do in typical rabbinic fashion. Deborah asked me to come talk, what is Jewish about social action? So I'm going to turn that back to you for just a moment. What do you think is Jewish about social action? I have some answers, but feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat, or just unmute yourself. What isn't? Love it. Yes. Tikkun Olam. Ellen, do you want to say what that is? Make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, it's repairing the world. I mean, and repairing the world is making sure that everybody has opportunity, has everything they need in terms of food and shelter and clean water and all that stuff. It's great. This is what Jews are supposed to be doing.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll join in. Before we turn this on, I was reading an article that came from sort of a White House group Dan Dunbar shared with me, and it was a story about the mostly or less written story of the Holocaust in Ukraine and the murder of thousands of Jews, not in concentration camps, but in pits. They were just shot. And when we talk about never again, and I'm mindful of a sermon, a discussion Rabbi Eric led to the effect that we may disagree, but not caring is not a Jewish option. And when we think about our history and the need to prevent injustice, much less a Holocaust to us or anybody else, call it social action, call it whatever you want, but we're called upon to not sit back and do nothing. That's not an option. That's what it means to me.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if you're Robin or if the person.
I'm Rick.
Rick, okay, great. Thanks.
I'm
Rick.
sorry.
No. I just want to call people by their names if possible. Anyone else want to add anything? All right, these are great. I think Deborah said everything. Ellen pointed to a concept from Jewish tradition, and then Rick pointed out, our history, our people's history and lived experience. So I broke down what is Jewish about social justice into 5 categories, and we can talk about, whether I've left something out, whether you agree with them. So I wanted to talk about, I think, prophetic values and the tradition of human dignity, and particularly in our sacred texts, is one place where social justice or social action is Jewish. Histories, our people's histories of anti-Jewish oppression, which Rick mentioned in a particular context. But certainly, the history of the land that is now Ukraine, not only the Shoah, but pogroms, and then of course, all over the world, Jews have faced oppression. We will be talking about one particular instance in about 2 weeks when we celebrate the holiday of Purim. The histories of the Jewish left, our people, particularly in the US, have been disproportionately represented in many social justice movements here. Community and family involvement. I believe Beth Meyer, like many synagogues, has a social action committee. That is a common thing in synagogues in the US. And our families also might have been involved. Not everyone's. My family happens to be very conservative and is not involved in social justice. But that is a story that is common to some parts of the Jewish community. And then we have a foundational liberation narrative in the book of Exodus, Shmot, which we will be celebrating in just a few months. Can't believe things are so close. So I bolded prophetic values and human dignity, and then at the end, foundational liberation narrative, because that's the place where I think I can contribute the most as a rabbi, as someone who is educated and grounded in Jewish texts. So we will talk a little bit about the middle ones, but I think that is something that I have less expertise on, personal expertise. So I'm going to focus on the first and the last areas. Okay, so we're going to jump right in with I'm going to be a good social justice Jew in the 21st century. And when we talk about that, who do we have to talk about? Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I don't always bring up because, he is very cited and perhaps overcited. However, around prophetic tradition and not just his social activism, he is less talked about. So just as a reminder, Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel was a theologian in the mid-20th century, and he influenced a lot of thinking in both the Orthodox and conservative worlds. He was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and a refugee from Nazi Poland, and watched from afar in horror as many of his family was murdered. And he wrote a book called The Prophets. And it was his, I think originally his PhD dissertation, and then he turned it into a book, which is really excellent. So the prophets appear in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and in the section that is called Nevi'im, meaning prophets. And they consist of course, like major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then a lot of other minor prophets. And Heschel argues that the prophets are rooted in both the human and divine realms. They sort of straddle both of those. They have this deep connection to God, or usually it's framed as God in these texts, but also are very much involved in what is happening around them. And that is sort of the central tension that they are grappling with. They are deeply saddened and angered by human sin against God, but also, and maybe even more vehemently, against humanity, and specifically the poor or the vulnerable. And the prophets are dramatic and indignant. If there's anything that the prophets carry, it is a vehemence. And the modern, one of the modern words that we use, it's not so common, but angry speech, an invective, is sometimes known as a Jeremiad, and that comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who is, of course, given to very angry speeches. So Heschel writes in the prophets' words are outbursts of violent emotions. Their rebuke is harsh and relentless. But if such sensitivity to evil is to be called hysterical, what name should be given to the abysmal indifference to evil, which the prophet bewails? The prophet's word is a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. And I just think this is really beautiful, and accords with my own experience. I don't consider myself a prophet. I'm not going to have so much hubris as to aspire to that. But certainly I do get, some pushback about why are you so focused on this all the time? What is, this, you sound very angry, or things like that. And many of you are maybe involved in social action at Beth Meyer, or just care about this and may have gotten something similar. But in my mind, like, this in the prophetic tradition is what we are called as Jews to do. And I think that's what Ellen said around Tikkun Olam. And Ellen added this beautiful note in the chat from Elie Wiesel: the opposite of love is apathy. And I think that's a really wonderful way to put it. What the prophets, I'll just say another word or two about the prophets, is that what they were so upset about is the people's indifference to suffering of the poor at the hands of a wealthy class that were exploiting their labor, allowing them to suffer, allowing them to be hungry and unclothed. And it's the indifference that the prophets so objected to. And I think, Rick, when you talked about what Rabbi Solomon said about, like, not caring is not an option. That is, the prophetic tradition. And then lastly, I'll just say, Heschel talks about the prophets because they thought that, indifference to suffering was so monstrous, they didn't believe in moderation or reform. They called out injustice against sort of society's most vulnerable. They did it in the streets. They did it before the powerful. They invade against, the priestly class. All these people, they spoke truth to power always, and they paid a high price for it. And so ultimately, the prophetic vision is drastic, it's radical, it's structural, it is all-encompassing. So this is the tradition from which we come. We have a whole section in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible that unrelentingly talks about our obligation to the vulnerable in our society. And I'll just then pick up one example. It's a very famous example, but we'll look at text from Yeshayahu, the book of Isaiah. And this is from, you may be familiar with it, traditionally the Haftarah, the selection from the writings for Yom Kippur in the afternoon. This is a direct call for us to be agents of justice. And I think it's significant that these verses, which we'll read in a second, is placed in sort of the centerpiece of our most holy day. We are called to certain ritual actions and like fasting and fasting most, but wearing white, not wearing leather, going to synagogue, etc. But we're also called on this day to act in ways that address the injustices in our society. So Yeshayahu, the prophet Isaiah, says, "Halo zeh som evcharehu." Pateach kartzubot resha, hater agudot mota, v'shalak retzutzim choshim, v'chol mota tenateku. No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and to untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. Halo faros la ra'ev lachmecha, va'aniyim merudim tavi vait, ki tir'eh arum v'chisito, u'mi v'sarecha lo tit alam. It is to share your bread with the hungry, and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to ignore your own kin. So this is where we are on our holiest day. As we heard in the prayer that I read by Rabbi Nachman, as we opened our session, we also have famous quotes from the prophet Amos, to let justice roll down like a mighty stream, which was a very famous, very beloved quote by figures such as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So this is the prophetic tradition. And I want to move then to an idea in our tradition that is about human dignity. And so I'm bringing this this text from Mishnah Sanhedrin, the Mishnah being, generally speaking, commentary on the Torah from the 2nd century CE. Part of this is our rabbinic tradition. So in Sanhedrin, we're told the first human was created alone. And this is referencing the creation story in the book of Bereshit and the book of Genesis. in which we have, in both accounts of creation, we have Adam, the first human, was created. We get the story of God creating human beings in our image. The question is, who is us? And then in another story, breathing life. But it's just one human that is created. Why? So that one person will not say to the another, my ancestor is greater than your ancestor. This serves to tell of the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be God, as when a person stamps several coins with one seal, they are all similar to each other. But the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be God, stamped all people with the seal of Adam, the first human, as all of them are his offspring, and not one of them is similar to another. Therefore, since all humanity descends from one person, each and every person is obligated to say, the world was created for me. Nivra ha'olam, bishvili nivra ha'olam. So the Mishnah here is using this metaphor, which is a little maybe not familiar to me, but the idea of creating coins with one seal. There's one sort of template that happens, and then lots of other coins that are created. So too is the first human being understood as a template, and then from the first human being came all human beings, and as all coins come from this one template. And the important thing is that they are both all from the same ancestor. So there's this beautiful equality here, and yet they're not all the same. They are individual. And this is the sort of the beautiful idea here of the dignity of each human being. We know, as I referenced in the creation story, very familiar to most of us, that we are created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And what this means is there is a divine spark in all of us. And this is a huge part of Jewish and rabbinic and current Jewish thought around how to understand the importance of human beings. So let's see. And then the last thing I'll say around sort of, well, that's not the last thing, but around just to add one more layer to this. This is about, God's understanding of human beings. And I'm going to share a text, which I love, which is from another part of the Mishnah, Avot, which is sometimes known as Pirkei Avot. Some of you may have either studied or heard some familiar texts. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from doing it. That's also in Pirkei Avot. So I love this text because it is adding a layer to the idea that of the importance of human beings being created in the image of God. So Hu Haya Omer, and we're talking about Rabbi Akiva, for whom my cat is named. Rabbi Akiva would say, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. Human beings are beloved, Chaviv, because they were created in the image of God, Nivra B'Tselem. Chiba Yetera, it is an even greater love, Noda'at Lo, that it is known to him, to human beings, Shenivra B'Tselem, that they were created in the image of God. So I love this text because it adds this one more layer. Not only are we created in the image of God, but God wanted us to know that we were created in the image of God. And according to Rabbi Akiva, who loved talking about love, he is the love rabbi, this is a sign that we are beloved to God, that God took the time to let us know we're created in the image of God. So it's sort of this double layer of human dignity. Okay, so one more one more idea from Jewish tradition is the word tzedakah. I'm sure many of you have heard the spiel that I'm about to give, but I think it is really a really important point that I want to underline. So we are the inheritors of a legal system from the rabbis, generally speaking, that teaches us ethical interpersonal practices, and not only ritual practices. We have a lot of ritual practices, but on par with those, at the same time, we are taught how to create equitable, mutually responsible relationships between like workers and employers, landlords and tenants, buyers and sellers, and really anyone between whom there's an imbalance or an unequal distribution of power. So I'm just gonna stop for a second. It looks like Deborah has a comment. I think referring to where I was before, that makes our obligation to act like we are created in the image of God greater. If we didn't know, we could plead ignorance to our obligations, but we do know, so there are no excuses. We have to act ethically. Yeah, Deborah, I think that's really beautiful. Did you want to add anything?
No, I just
Okay.
think that I think it's telling about our tradition that the great rabbis like Akiva really felt that it was important that we understand that we had this, first of all, we had this relationship with God, that we knew this, but also what the implications are for our actions, for our behavior.
Great. And that leads well into this word tzedakah. Now, I'm sure you've heard the spiel. Tzedakah is sort of used casually in the Jewish community, right, to mean giving, charitable giving. You know, that's how I use it in my own life. I give 10% of my earnings towards tzedakah. And I sort of say, like, yeah, charitable giving. But as I'm sure all of you know, the root is tzedek, Sade Dalid Kuf. And that word, everyone together, what does tzedek mean?
Righteousness.
Justice,
righteousness, yes. So we understand the act of giving as righteous behavior or justice. It is not optional. It is not an act. Charity is an inadequate word to describe our obligation of tzedakah. And when we say things like charity or giving, often we're sort of implying a generosity that's sort of like beyond what is expected. But in Jewish thought, tzedakah is a requirement. In Jewish law, alongside our ritual practices, we have these ethical obligations as well. And Jewish tradition here makes very practical demands on us and specifies expectations. And I think the other aspect of tzedakah is about the understanding in Jewish tradition that we're not owners of the land and of the earth. We certainly learn in the creation story that we are to be stewards, and we are given the earth by the Creator, and we are to tend and care for it. So what that has come to mean in some areas of Jewish thought is that we are stewards of the world's resources. That's not something we own. And so that means that we are committed to ensuring the well-being of those in need and to redistribute that money, those resources that are entrusted to us in an equitable way. And that's what tzedakah ultimately comes to mean. All right. So that is sort of prophetic and textual tradition, prophetic tradition, and then tradition about the inherent human dignity of all people, the infinite worth that each person has as a birthright. All right, so I these are the three middle ones, middle reasons that social justice or social action is Jewish, that I'm going to run through a little bit more quickly. And I want to start this little section with a video. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and share a video, which I think really brings this point home in a really interesting way. So let's see. Yes, if I'm going to share again, and we're going to hope everyone can hear. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this video is called "We Were Strangers Too." Can everyone see it? See a video clip? Okay, great. It's called "We Were Strangers Too," and it is it was put together by Jewish JCUA, Jewish Community. Okay, I'll have to remember what it is. Jewish community. Anyway, I'll look it up in a second. So it's a very short video, just a little over a minute, and I'm gonna see if I can. All right, show you.
I went to school like all the other kids, but I always knew I was different.
My father worked hard back home, but there were no jobs. What else could he do? He had to provide for us.
Sometimes I think when I was young, I went to school like all the other kids, but I always knew I was different.
My father worked hard back home, but there were no jobs. What else could he do? He had to provide for us.
Sometimes I think I'll just go back, but that place isn't mine. I've been here since I was 2. This is my home.
My father loved America. He worked here 8 years, saved up to bring us over here.
I want to follow the rules, but there are none to help me. My whole life I've been trapped outside the system.
We lived in Rogers Park in Chicago. Everyone on the block spoke my language. It was just like being back home.
One night, my friend got stopped for a burned out taillight. I was just a passenger, but they asked for my papers. That was it.
My father did everything by the books, but he was also blessed. Our country believed in immigration back then.
Next thing I know, I'm in custody. They're talking about sending me away. How could this happen to me?
My name is Saul. I moved to America from Poland in 1920. I was 7 years old.
My name is Jose. My parents brought me to America from Mexico when I was 2 years old.
We were strangers too. Take action and join the campaign for just and compassionate immigration reform at jcua.org/strangers.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, which is in Chicago. So what I love about this video is that it is pulling not from Jewish text or tradition, but from our lived experience by, as you realize, switching the narratives from a immigrant, what I presume is an undocumented immigrant in today's world, and then what was probably an undocumented immigrant in the 1920s. And really showing how much those experiences are very similar. So let's see, going back to my slides. And I think that's a huge, like when we talk about social justice or social action, a lot of times we assume that we're all, that we might all have the same motivations. But one of the things that I really like about that video and sort of talking about this is that we might have very different motivations for why we might engage in this work. So we could call the situation that was presented in that video, the history of anti-Jewish oppression. There's a reason why Saul's family came from Poland. There are, as I talked about, histories of the Jewish left in this country. Jews have been often disproportionately represented in civil rights movements here, like union and labor organizing, strikes, the civil rights movement, all kinds. I'm guessing many of you have stories of your family's involvement, and know about these stories. Let's see, I see there's someone in the chat. Yes. Deborah adds, as Haya says, we used to work with refugees because they were Jews. Now we work with refugees because we are Jews. And Deborah, once again, that so well dovetails into my next point. And I wanted to end with this because this to me is really the most powerful answer to what is Jewish about social justice. So we're going to start with a text from the book of Exodus from Shmot. Probably either this or a version of this is very familiar to me. V'ger lo tilchatz ve'atem yiratem et nefesh hager ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. So this is, of course, one of the things that God tells the people of Israel after the Exodus from Egypt. And of course, this story is what we tell and retell every year during Pesach, during Passover, which is by far the most celebrated Jewish holiday, whether people are very religious or not at all and secular. People celebrate Passover and celebrate often with Seder and with family. And what this means is that this is probably the story from which this text comes is probably the most well-known in Jewish tradition. And that is very important because I think it's also this idea of not oppressing the strangers because we were strangers is sort of like I would say the most important message in Judaism. In Baba Metzia, one of the rabbis says, don't oppress the stranger. A call to care for the vulnerable appears 36 times, and some people say 46 times in Jewish tradition. There's more said about that than there is said about Shabbat or keeping kosher or any other number of things that you could talk about. Do not oppress the stranger. And I want to just say something about this that is not always mentioned. There's something very radical in this verse. Rabbi Shai Held, who's one of my teachers, who teaches at Hadar in New York, and he has just gorgeous Torah, a lot of it about love in Jewish tradition. Recommend everything Rav Shai has ever written. But Rav Shai points out the truly radical nature of this seemingly simple command. And he says, memory is ethically neutral. There's no reason, there's no obvious connection between remembering what happened to us in Egypt and the actions we have to take now. It might seem obvious to us because that's how we have learned to understand that experience in Egypt. But the truth is, we could remember and not take a lesson from it about not doing that. We could just remember. So Rav Shai says, the Torah here appeals to our memory to intensify our ethical obligations. Having tasted the suffering and degradation to which vulnerability can lead, we are bidden not to oppress the stranger. So I think that's what the book of Exodus teaches us. That's what we reenact, as you know, on Pesach during the Seder, we are told that every person is obligated to understand as if they themselves have come out of Egypt. And the book of Exodus and our experience with the Seder teaches us it's not enough to just remember. Rabbi Shai says, one of the Torah's central projects is to turn memory into empathy and moral responsibility. And it didn't have to be that way. And that's the tradition that we get. We get it in Torah, and then we certainly get it in the rabbinic tradition. And yeah, to the extent that we fail in our obligations to the vulnerable, we are failing to remember our experiences in Egypt. And thus we retell the story every year at Passover. All right, so I'm going to conclude with a little pitch for CJJ, which, as Deborah said, is how we met, and working with Deborah has also been a real pleasure. So Carolina Jews for Justice was founded 8 years ago now, and this is our mission. CJJ is a grassroots network committed to creating a more just, fair, and compassionate North Carolina. We build relationships where people help each other because individuals have a profound responsibility for the well-being of the whole. So CJJ, when it was founded, came out of a couple different places. And I just want to mention this because it does, relate to what we're talking about today. One of the places was the Moral Mondays March, which, if you are in Wake County or Raleigh, where Beth Meyer is, the project of Reverend William Barber. And what a lot of Jews in North Carolina, and particularly in the Triangle area, felt that there wasn't specifically Jewish representation at Moral Mondays March. Not because the movement was exclusionary or anything, but just Jews weren't coming together as Jews to participate. So there were a group of people who thought, we need to do this. The values that Reverend Barber and his and the Poor People's Campaign are advocating for are ones that are deeply in Jewish tradition, for all the reasons we just talked about, because they're in our sacred texts, because of our history as a people, because of our familial histories. This is who we are, and we want to be a part of this as Jews. So there were some really compelling and beautiful actions that happened, particularly in the state capitol. And then in the West, CJJ coalesced around the same events that were happening, just in a satellite area. The Moral Mondays marches, were concentrated in Raleigh at the state capitol, but there were satellite protests and marches going on all over the state. And one of the founders of the chapter in the West had pulled together a group to go join the Moral Mondays march in the Asheville area, and was essentially walking out of her synagogue with the synagogue's banner, wanting to represent the synagogue, and was told, no, you can't do that. We're not ready for our synagogue, or for whatever reason, you're not able to go as a member of the synagogue to this march. And I think that really clarified for the people in this Asheville area that they needed an organization that was going to be committed to doing justice as Jews. And so today, Carolina Jews for Justice is the only statewide Jewish social justice organization. We're very proud of that. We're small, and we are trying to grow. As Deborah said, I was the first executive director, and now we have our second, and we have 3 organizers now, where we started with 2. So it is very exciting.
We actually started with 1.
Oh yes, with 1, and then we had.
No, we
2.
actually started with none.
Yeah.
I mean, for a long time there was just us.
Yes.
We had our first organizer. It was part-time, and it was so exciting.
Yes, that actually is a very important part of CJJ, is that it was founded and held together by volunteers for many years, and volunteers and our community members still form, the base and are the heart of the organization. So as Deborah knows and is a part of, there is a Wake County chapter of Carolina Jews for Justice. And if you want more information, you can talk to Deborah, who is on the steering committee. And we do work on a variety of things, on immigration, on fair housing, on police reform, on racism, and specifically voting rights, yes. And then especially on anti-Semitism. This has been a focus that we've been moving towards in the past couple of years. Because we know that Jews need to understand deeply our stake in justice work, and part of our stake is the history of anti-Jewish oppression and the history of anti-Semitism in the world. And so we know that there a lot of times are not places for Jews to talk about anti-Semitism, to understand their own experiences. And in a world where, a lot of Jews are white and aren't the direct, aren't often or not the direct victims of these oppressive systems, it can be easy for us and for others to dismiss our experience of anti-Semitism. And so one of the things CJJ wants to do is to create a space where we as Jews can talk with each other about anti-Semitism and do some healing from that, and also acknowledge the very real and continued threat that exists. All right, I've talked for a long time. Ideas, insights, questions. What did I leave out? What do you want to know more about? What do you want to say I don't agree with about?
Well, if nobody else has something, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I do have a question.
Yes.
I noticed, this is something we've gone around and around about at our synagogue in terms of our social action committee. I noticed that you use the term social justice rather than social action. Do you see a difference between, I do. Do you see a difference between the one and the other? And why did you choose the one over the other?
Yeah. Why don't you tell me, what do you think the difference is?
I think that social action is, a safer term. I think that social justice implies systemic change, and social action implies, I don't want to say charity because I think it's more extensive than that, but working within, this is my lefty background coming out, working within the system rather than working to change the system. I think that social justice means working to change the system. And I actually think that that's what the prophets were talking about, was a change in the system rather than ameliorating the conditions that people were experiencing within the system. So I see that as the two differences. And I do believe that is, I mean, we were actually told by our board that we couldn't call ourselves social justice. We had to call ourselves social action. And I think that's why. I think it made them very uncomfortable. They didn't say so, but I think that was the reason. So I just wondered whether you thought the same way and why you chose that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do see in synagogues, around our country, that social action or Tikkun Olam tends to be a term that feels, I think, a little more either familiar or, as you said, safer. Justice, I think, does. The prophets do call us to justice, which, as I said, means something pretty radical and systemic. And yes, that is uncomfortable for some Jews. I think we see that in debates about a variety of things. Certainly within CJJ, we have a lot of people who are very values aligned. Who of course say like racism is terrible and we need to be actively fighting against it. We may have different political solutions to that. I think about police reform. Some people say we should reform the police, or defund them, maybe moving a little bit more to the left, or abolish the police. and not everyone agrees, on what the solution should be. We agree that, it's not good for young Black men to be killed by police, but we don't always agree on like how we should be working towards changing that. So.
So again, if nobody else has anything to say, I do have another thing. This is something you and I have discussed, but
Right.
I think that it's an issue that a lot of us who are involved, I know CJJ is grappling with it, but that a lot of us who are involved in social justice or social action as Jews have encountered, and it can be difficult. The intersection between Jews in social action and, for want of a better word, non-Jewish organizations with whom we'd like to partner, but being Jewish can be loaded for a variety of different reasons, both for us and for them. So how I mean, in 5 minutes or less, how do we navigate that space?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And one of the, one of our goals of our anti-Semitism work is to give us a chance to talk about, like what I think, as I've spent an hour talking about, justice is very Jewish, and that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to being Jewish in justice spaces. And I think there's a couple of things. One is that Jews are perceived a certain way. There are a lot of stereotypes about Jews, which aren't always true. I mean, stereotypes do come from some places. The Jewish community in the US is overwhelmingly white and is overwhelmingly, middle to upper class. That is true. And that erases, of course, Jews of color and Jews of poor Jews or working class Jews. But it also makes people on the left who have analyses of the way power works think that Jews are powerful or all powerful. And that's where the conspiracy theories come in. And so a lot of times on the left, you see people saying, thinking that like attacking Jews or, somehow marginalizing them is okay because Jews have power. And so they think it is, a way of saying it is like punching up, and it's okay. And a lot of us who do justice work understand, yes, part of doing justice work is speaking truth to power. And so there are places on the left where the Jews are lumped in with that. And we know from our texts, our history, our family involvement, our history as a people, that Jews are not universally powerful. And certainly any conspiracy theory that says we control the world, we have space lasers, whatever ridiculous thing is said, is not true. And anyone who says that Jews have, sort of are all powerful or have some sort of disproportionate power, completely ignore, our history as a people and our family's history, in which we have been always a minority and pretty much in almost unvaryingly a persecuted minority. And it's certainly in the, in 21st century America, it is harder for people to see that because most Jews are white, because Jews have class privilege and education privilege and all of that. It is hard for people to see that. So there can be a way in which we feel not welcome in leftist spaces. And then Deborah, I think you also were alluding to what you and I have talked a lot about, which is people on the left understanding themselves in solidarity with Palestinians, which can feel alienating. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think we can care about Palestinians, believe in human rights for Palestinians, and believe in the state of Israel, and understand that as an integral part of our identities. But that is often hard, I think, for for Jews to hold, because I think that we're too often told that those two things can't coexist. And I think it's hard for non-Jews to hold too, because of the way they understand Jewish power. So yeah, what I would say is people who are committed to justice, like we need to be coming together, talking to each other, being in relationship, trying to understand each other. And that to me is how we get things done, how we create justice in the world, and then also how ultimately we ensure safety for ourselves in this country. We do want a vibrant, multiracial democracy. We know that fascism never ends well for Jews, that partnering with people who are marginalized is, and ensuring we have a robust democracy here in the US is what is good for the Jews. So that means, and if we only partnered with people that we agreed with on everything, we couldn't partner with anyone. So, like that, it does mean sometimes, being in places where Palestinian solidarity is raised in a way that we might think is a distraction. Like that's not what we're talking about. And I'll just say that I think for a lot of people who understand sort of, that all oppressions are related, it is related. It is not a distraction. And so I think we have to do a lot of dialogue to be talking with each other and be committed to working out differences that we may have.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, it is 12:02, so I want to be again respectful of everyone's time. Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah.
I've recorded this, so if you weren't able to listen to all of it, or if you know people who weren't able to come, it will be on the Beth Meyer website, and you can go there. And Salem, thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.